Hey guys, tonight we're talking about Rome, the empire that conquered half the known world and still found time to be extremely petty about it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When Rome captured a queen, it did not see a defeated woman sitting quietly in a tent wondering how everything went so wrong. Rome saw a logistical nightmare wrapped in a crown. Queens were not standard prisoners. They could not be processed, catalogued and forgotten like a sack of captured spears. They were walking political problems with excellent posture and very bad timing. Rome loved order. Rome loved hierarchy. Rome loved rules. And a captured queen broke several of them just by existing. She had ruled. She had commanded armies. People had obeyed her willingly, which already made her suspicious. Worse still, she had done all of this without Roman permission, paperwork, or supervision. Frankly, the audacity. To Rome, a queen was not dangerous because she could fight. She was dangerous because people believed in her. Soldiers obey orders. Followers believe. Belief is much harder to kill, and Rome preferred not to leave unfinished business lying around. This is why Rome didn't treat queens like ordinary captives. A regular prisoner could be sold, enslaved, or executed without much thought. A queen required meetings, discussions, someone inevitably saying, "We can't just kill her, people are watching." Rome was many things, but subtle without an audience was not one of them. Rome also had a talent for turning personal tragedy into public education. A captured queen was a gift, not to her, obviously, but to the empire's messaging department. She could be displayed, paraded, whispered about, and pointed at. Rome could say, without speaking a word, "This is what happens when you try ruling on your own." And Rome loved a good visual. A queen stripped of power but kept alive was far more effective than a corpse. A dead queen could become a martyr. A living, humiliated queen became a warning label with legs. There was also the issue of ego. Rome did not like being challenged, and it especially disliked being challenged by someone who wore a crown and didn't answer to a Roman man with a clipboard. The punishment had to be thorough. It had to be humiliating, and it had to be memorable. So from the moment a queen was captured, her fate was no longer about justice, mercy, or even revenge. It became a performance review conducted by an empire with excellent attendance. She was no longer a ruler. She was a lesson. Rome liked power arranged neatly. Power flowed upward, stopped at Rome, and did not ask questions. Anything outside that structure made Romans uncomfortable, and nothing made them more uncomfortable than a rival ruler who appeared to be doing just fine without Roman supervision. Kings were annoying, but familiar. Rome had been dealing with kings for centuries. They were predictable. They argued, negotiated, paid tribute, and eventually lost wars in an orderly fashion. Queens, however, introduced an additional layer of discomfort. Not because Rome had never seen powerful women, it absolutely had, but because a queen ruling independently broke several unspoken rules at once. A ruling queen suggested that authority did not require Roman approval, Roman bloodlines, or Roman institutions. Even worse, it suggested that loyalty could exist outside Rome's carefully managed ecosystem. From a Roman perspective, this was not rebellion. This was ideological contamination. Rome did not officially say, "We dislike female rulers." Rome was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, Roman writers quietly framed queens as unnatural, excessive, emotional, or dangerously charismatic. Anything that suggested their rule was an anomaly rather than a legitimate system. This was less about gender and more about control. Rome disliked anyone who made ruling look achievable without them. And let's be honest, Rome also hated competition. A queen who successfully governed, inspired loyalty, and resisted Rome made the empire look temporarily fallible. Rome did not do fallible. Rome did inevitability. So when such a queen was captured, Rome saw an opportunity, not simply to punish, but to correct the narrative. Her capture allowed Rome to say, "See, this arrangement was always unstable." Her humiliation reinforced the idea that sovereignty outside Rome was not just doomed, it was embarrassing. This is why Roman punishments for queens were so carefully designed. They were not impulsive acts of cruelty. They were lectures delivered in chains. Rome wanted other rulers, male or female, to observe the outcome and internalize the lesson without requiring further explanation. And of course, Rome never admitted fear, but fear was there. Fear that authority might exist independently. Fear that loyalty could survive conquest. Fear that someone somewhere might watch a queen resist Rome and think, maybe we could do that too. Rome did not punish captured queens because they had lost. Rome punished them because they had once ruled, and for a moment, ruled well. For a Roman enemy queen, capture was not the end of the story. It was the paperwork phase. The war might be over, the city burned, the army scattered, but Rome was only just getting started. Rome never rushed consequences. It preferred to savour them. The moment a queen was taken alive, her fate stopped being about battlefield realities and became a matter of scheduling. She was no longer a combatant. She was an asset, and Rome, like any competent empire, did not waste assets. Captured queens were transported carefully. Not gently, just carefully enough to ensure they arrived intact. You cannot stage a public lesson if the lesson expires on the road. Guards were instructed to keep her alive, visible, and unmistakably defeated. This was not mercy. This was preparation. Rome also understood that time itself was a weapon. Weeks or months might pass between capture and public punishment. During that silence, rumours spread. Did she survive? Was she executed? Was she being paraded through Roman streets? Uncertainty did the work of fear long before chains ever clinked. Meanwhile, Roman officials debated what role she would play. Would she be marched in a triumph? Kept alive as leverage? Quietly erased later? Rome loved options. A captured queen gave the empire flexibility, and Rome valued flexibility almost as much as it valued making examples. For the queen herself, this waiting period was its own punishment. No information, no timeline, no control. She had ruled armies and peoples, and now her future depended on men who discussed her fate between wine cups and administrative complaints. It was power stripped down to its absence. Rome had learned through experience that immediate executions created martyrs. Martyrs inspired songs, stories, and inconvenient rebellions. Rome preferred something colder. A living queen, held in limbo, sent a stronger message. Resistance does not end quickly, and it does not end cleanly. This period also allowed Rome to dismantle her identity. Titles were ignored. Royal status was treated as irrelevant. She was referred to not as a ruler, but as the woman, the captive, or the barbarian. Language mattered. Rome was already rewriting her story before the public ever saw her. By the time the queen reappeared, whether in chains or in silence, she was no longer presented as a leader who had challenged Rome. She was presented as proof that challenging Rome was a terrible long-term plan. Capture was not the conclusion. It was the setup. To modern ears, a triumph sounds pleasant. Something involving applause, smiles, and maybe a tasteful speech. Rome's triumph was none of those things. It was a victory parade designed by people who believed humiliation was a public service. A triumph was Rome's way of turning conquest into theatre. Streets were cleared, temples were opened, crowds gathered, and at the centre of it all marched the spoils of war: treasure, weapons, exotic animals, and most importantly, defeated enemies who were still alive. For a captured queen, the triumph was not an honour. It was the most carefully choreographed insult imaginable. She was paraded through Rome behind the victorious general, sometimes in chains, sometimes bound with symbolic restraints that ensured everyone noticed she was no longer in charge. The crowd did not need instructions. They understood their role immediately. This was the part where you stare, whisper, laugh, and remember that Rome wins. Rome loved visual storytelling. The Queen's presence was meant to contrast sharply with the general riding high, wrapped in purple, pretending to be almost divine for the day. She walked. He rode. She followed. He led. The message was so clear it barely needed translation. Her appearance was deliberately foreign. Roman triumphs emphasized difference. Strange clothing, unfamiliar jewellery, unusual hairstyles, all of it designed to reinforce the idea that she came from a lesser world that had been neatly folded into Roman dominance. Rome did not just conquer territories, it conquered narratives. The crowd mattered. Rome could have punished her privately. It chose not to. A punishment unseen was a wasted opportunity. Tens of thousands of people watching ensured that the humiliation would echo far beyond the city. Stories would spread. Travellers would repeat them. Future rebels would picture her before ever lifting a sword, and Rome enjoyed the delay. The triumph often happened long after the war ended. By then, the Queen had been waiting, aware of what was coming, but powerless to stop it. Anticipation sharpened the cruelty. Rome did not shout during triumphs. It did not need to. Silence, chains, and contrast did all the work. The Queen's role was simple: exist as living evidence of Roman inevitability. By the time the triumph ended, the lesson had already been delivered. Everything that followed was just administration. Rome understood something fundamental about power. You don't just defeat an enemy. You redesign how they are seen. And nothing reshapes perception faster than clothing. For a captured queen, what she wore during her punishment was never accidental. It was costume design for an empire that treated humiliation like a fine art. Queens who had once appeared in royal robes, heavy with symbolism and authority, were stripped of everything that made them look like rulers. Their clothing during a triumph was chosen carefully, exotic enough to mark them as foreign, elaborate enough to draw attention, and unfamiliar enough to invite mockery. Rome wanted the crowd to see difference first, dignity second, and humanity somewhere much later. This was not about comfort. It was about contrast. Roman spectators were meant to compare the defeated queen's appearance to the victorious general towering above her in ceremonial purple. One embodied order and civilization. The other embodied chaos that had been corrected. Rome loved a visual metaphor it didn't have to explain. Even jewellery mattered. Items that once signalled power were reduced to curiosities. Necklaces became trophies. Crowns became props. Sometimes queens were allowed to wear symbols of their former status, not out of respect, but because seeing authority emptied of power was more satisfying than seeing it removed entirely. Rome believed humiliation worked best when it reminded everyone what had been lost, and the crowd noticed everything. Whispers travelled fast. Comments were made. Comparisons followed. She ruled them? Someone would say, looking her up and down. Rome relied on that reaction. The empire outsourced part of its punishment to public opinion. There was also a deeper message hidden in the fabric. By emphasizing foreignness, Rome reinforced the idea that this queen had never truly belonged in the world of power. Her rule was framed as a strange anomaly rather than a legitimate system. Rome didn't say she was unfit to rule, it let her clothing suggest it. For the queen herself, the effect was devastating. Clothing is identity. To be forced into garments that redefined you in front of thousands was to have your past rewritten in real time. She was no longer seen as a ruler who lost a war. She was seen as a spectacle who never should have ruled at all. Rome didn't need words. The fabric did the talking. If Rome wanted to make a point absolutely unmistakable, it added children. Not as an accident, not as collateral damage. as a feature. When captured queens were paraded in triumphs, they were sometimes forced to appear alongside their children. This was not done out of cruelty alone, although cruelty was very much present, but out of calculation. Rome understood that nothing communicates total victory like demonstrating control over the future. A queen without heirs could still inspire rebellion. A queen whose children stood beside her in chains? That was finality with a bow on top. To Roman spectators, the message was devastatingly clear. Not only had Rome defeated the ruler, it had neutralized the bloodline. No avengers waiting in the wings. No rightful heirs growing up beyond Rome's reach. The story ended here, in the street, in front of everyone. Rome liked clean endings. The presence of children also softened the queen's image in a very specific way. Not toward sympathy, but toward inevitability. A woman dragging her children through humiliation was no longer seen as a defiant leader. She was framed as a tragic figure whose resistance had failed not only herself, but those who depended on her. Rome loved that framing. It transferred blame away from the empire and placed it squarely on the defeated ruler. And yes, it was deliberate. Roman audiences were not encouraged to think, "How cruel." They were encouraged to think, "This is what happens when you resist." For the queen, this was perhaps the sharpest edge of punishment. Authority stripped away is one thing. Watching your children become props in Rome's performance was another. Rome did not simply conquer lands, it invaded family bonds and repurposed them as warnings. The children themselves were not always killed. Some were absorbed into Roman households. Some disappeared into obscurity. Some were kept alive as insurance against future rebellions. Rome preferred leverage to bloodshed whenever possible. But survival did not mean freedom. Growing up, Romanized, renamed, and removed from their origins ensured that whatever legacy the queen had built would not continue in recognizable form. Rome did not just end reigns, it redesigned futures. To Rome, this was efficiency. To history, it was chilling. Because the empire understood something most conquerors eventually learn. To truly defeat a ruler, you do not just destroy the throne, you erase the line that could ever reclaim it. When Rome allowed a captured queen to live, it was not being merciful, it was being strategic. Rome did not confuse survival with kindness, and neither should we. Keeping a queen alive was often the most efficient way to extend her punishment indefinitely. A dead queen could inspire rebellion, a living one could suppress it. Rome understood optics. A queen breathing, visible, and thoroughly powerless sent a clearer message than an execution ever could. Her people could not rally around a martyr if the former ruler was still alive, especially if she was seen paraded, imprisoned, or reduced to a name spoken only in whispers. Hope fades faster when the symbol of resistance is still there, visibly broken. So Rome kept some queens alive on purpose. These women were housed in controlled environments, guarded residences, temples, or prisons, where every movement was monitored and every interaction filtered. They were fed, clothed, and medically maintained just enough to remain functional. Think less honoured captive, and more carefully preserved warning sign. The cruelty was subtle, which made it effective. No crowds, no cheering. Just endless days without power, purpose, or agency. Rome understood that rulers accustomed to command did not need chains to feel imprisoned. Silence worked just as well. From Rome's perspective, this was good governance. A living queen could be referenced in negotiations. Her existence could be mentioned casually to discourage uprisings. "You know, she's still alive," was often enough to quiet ambitious leaders who remembered how her resistance ended. And if she stopped being useful? Rome was nothing if not adaptable. Survival also allowed Rome to reshape her story. Over time, the queen became less a ruler and more a rumour. Roman writers redefined her as misguided, reckless, or doomed by her own ambition. The longer she lived under Roman control, the easier it became to convince everyone that her rule had always been unstable. From the Queen's perspective, survival was a slow dismantling. Each day erased another layer of identity. No court, no authority, no voice, just existence without influence. Rome didn't need to torture her physically. It let time do the work. Because for an empire obsessed with control, the most satisfying punishment wasn't death. It was watching power fade, one quiet day at a time. Roman imprisonment was not about iron bars and dramatic dungeon scenes. That would have been far too obvious. For captured queens, imprisonment was subtler and far more effective. Rome didn't just lock them away. It removed everything that had ever made them dangerous. A queen in captivity was not treated like a criminal. She was treated like an inconvenience that needed to be contained politely. She might live in a guarded villa, a temple complex, or a carefully monitored residence rather than a cell. From the outside, it could almost look comfortable, and that was the point. Rome understood that visible comfort softened outrage. A queen kept alive, fed, and housed allowed Rome to claim moral superiority while quietly dismantling her authority. No chains were needed when no one listened to her anymore. The true prison was isolation. Queens were separated from supporters, advisors, and anyone who might remind them of who they had once been. Communication was controlled. Visitors were filtered. Letters vanished mysteriously. Rome did not forbid contact outright. It simply made sure nothing meaningful survived the process. And then there was routine. Endless, dull, carefully structured routine. No decisions to make. No orders to give. No audience. For someone raised to command, routine was a form of psychological erosion. Each day stripped away another layer of relevance. Rome also understood the power of uncertainty. Queens were rarely told how long they would be held. Days blurred into months, months into years. The future existed only as a vague administrative possibility discussed somewhere far away by men who never intended to include her. Occasionally, a Roman official would visit, not to negotiate, not to threaten, just to observe, to remind her that Rome still remembered she existed, and that Rome alone decided when she stopped existing. This was not mercy, it was management. Rome preferred queens alive but inert, visible but silent, remembered but powerless. A living ruler with no authority was proof that Rome's dominance extended beyond battlefields and into identity itself. And for the outside world, the message was quietly reinforced. Resistance does not end with death. Sometimes it ends with years of waiting in a comfortable room where nothing you say matters. For Rome, this was elegant punishment. No blood, no noise, just control, applied slowly, relentlessly, and with impeccable organization. One of Rome's favorite tools was time, not speed, not urgency, time. Rome understood that uncertainty could grind a person down far more efficiently than chains ever could. So when it came to captured queens, Rome rarely announced plans. It simply waited. Queens were almost never told what would happen next. Execution was not scheduled. Release was not discussed. There was no calendar, no countdown, no sense of progression. Just days that blended together, each one quietly identical to the last. Rome believed clarity was a privilege, and defeated rulers had not earned it. From Rome's perspective, this was excellent policy. A queen who did not know her fate could not plan, could not hope properly, and could not prepare herself emotionally for anything in particular. Hope without direction becomes anxiety, and anxiety is exhausting. Rome outsourced much of its punishment to the human mind. Some queens waited months, others waited years. A few waited long enough that their names faded from conversation, their rebellions reduced to footnotes, their existence remembered only by guards who rotated shifts and administrators who filed reports. Rome had patience. Empires always do. And Rome enjoyed flexibility. A living queen could be useful today and inconvenient tomorrow. If her former people stirred, her survival could be mentioned casually as reassurance or threat. If political winds shifted, her execution could be delayed indefinitely Rome liked options. Certainty limited options. The uncertainty also worked outward. Other rulers heard rumours. She is still alive. No, she has been killed. No, she is in Rome. Confusion spread. Fear followed. Rome did not need to clarify. Ambiguity did the job beautifully. For the Queen, this was perhaps the cruelest phase. She had already lost power. Now she lost time itself. Days passed without meaning. Years dissolved without milestones. Waiting became existence. Rome didn't take her life. It took her future, and refused to explain why. Occasionally, hope returned. A new governor, a new emperor, a change in policy. Perhaps mercy would come. Rome allowed those thoughts to live just long enough to be crushed quietly by silence. Rome did not rush punishment because it did not need to. The empire had learned something profound. When you control the timeline, you control the person. And so the Queen waited, and waited, and waited. Because Rome believed the most effective punishment was not knowing when the story ended. Popular imagination likes its executions loud, theatrical, and soaked in spectacle. Rome, however, was a practical empire. When it came time to finally end a captured queen's life, drama was usually unnecessary. The performance had already happened. The lesson had been delivered. What remained was administration. Most executions of captured queens were deliberately private. No crowds, no speeches, no emotional closure. Rome had already used the queen as a symbol in triumphs, rumours, and years of captivity. There was no need to repeat the message. Repetition risked sympathy, and Rome disliked sympathy almost as much as rebellion. Execution, when it happened, was often handled inside prisons or controlled residences. Strangulation was common. It was efficient, quiet, and left no public remains to inspire devotion. Rome preferred methods that did not generate stories. A storyless death was a successful death, and timing mattered. Executions rarely took place immediately after capture. They were delayed until Rome had extracted every possible political benefit. The queen lived only as long as she was useful. Once she became irrelevant, the empire moved on with administrative calm. From Rome's point of view, this was restraint. The empire liked to imagine itself civilized, rational, and above emotional violence. Killing a queen loudly would have suggested anger. Rome preferred the appearance of inevitability. This is simply how things conclude, the silence seemed to say. For the queen, the end came without ceremony. No final speech, no chance to reclaim dignity, no dramatic resistance. Just the quiet realization that the waiting had ended, and Rome had decided she was no longer necessary. And for the world outside, the absence of drama mattered. There was no public execution to mark the moment. No clear ending, just silence, rumours, and eventual forgetting. Rome understood that forgetting was often more effective than fear. Execution was not Rome's grand finale. It was paperwork completed. By the time the queen was gone, her story had already been rewritten, her authority dismantled, and her memory softened into something manageable. The empire did not need her alive or dead. It only needed her irrelevant. And when that condition was met, Rome closed the file. Rome liked to separate spectacle from consequence. The applause came first. The silence came later. By the time a captured queen was executed, the crowd had long gone home. The triumphal decorations had been taken down, and Rome had already moved on to its next victory. This timing was not accidental. It was policy. Public punishment was for education. Death was for closure. Rome understood that crowds were unpredictable. Public executions could stir sympathy, outrage, or inconvenient emotional attachment. A queen killed in front of an audience risked becoming something Rome hated deeply: a martyr. Martyrs inspire stories. Stories inspire resistance. Rome preferred endings that produced paperwork, not legends. So the execution often happened after the city had finished celebrating. When the cheering stopped, when the general returned to private life, when the spectacle faded from memory, That was when Rome acted. Quietly, efficiently, without witnesses who might care. To the Roman public, the queen simply vanished. One day she was a name whispered during the triumph. The next, she was no longer mentioned. Silence replaced outrage. Silence replaced curiosity. Rome trusted silence to do what violence could not. This delay also allowed Rome to control emotional distance. By the time death came, the queen had already been reduced to an abstract idea. No longer a living figure walking the streets in chains, she became a rumour, a footnote, a former problem that had been handled. Executing her at that point felt less like cruelty, and more like closing a chapter everyone had already stopped reading. Rome also benefited diplomatically. Executing a queen immediately could provoke backlash from allies, relatives, or dependent kingdoms. Waiting allowed tensions to cool. By the time death occurred, objections had lost urgency. Rome was very good at letting outrage expire naturally. For the queen, this timing added one last cruelty. The execution came not at the height of attention, but after isolation, waiting, and erasure. There was no dramatic end, just the quiet realization that Rome had finished using her. Rome did not want its enemies remembered at their strongest. It wanted them remembered at their weakest, or not at all. And so the queen died, not as a ruler, not as a rebel, not even as a symbol. She died after the applause, when no one was listening. Which, from Rome's perspective, was exactly the point. For Rome, killing a queen was not always the final step. Sometimes it was unnecessary. Sometimes it was inefficient. The most thorough punishment was not death, but disappearance. Rome had a talent for making people vanish without ever leaving a body behind. Erasure was subtle. It didn't require chains, guards, or witnesses. It required scribes. Roman historians, poets, and officials controlled the narrative, and they used that power generously. Queens who had once commanded armies and territories were reduced to brief mentions, distorted anecdotes, or vague warnings about barbarian women. Their names were misspelled, minimized, or omitted entirely. Rome did not deny that these queens existed. It simply made sure they did not matter. This was not accidental. Rome understood that memory is power. If people remember a ruler clearly, they may remember why they followed her. If they forget her, loyalty dissolves on its own. Rome preferred forgetting. It required no troops. In some cases, queens were absorbed into Roman life so quietly that history lost track of them altogether. They were renamed, reassigned, married off, converted into polite footnotes living under Roman supervision. Official records stopped referring to them as queens. They became wives, daughters, or foreign women, stripped of the very titles that once made them threatening. Even when queens were remembered, Rome rewrote their personalities. Leadership became arrogance, strategy became recklessness, resistance became madness. Roman writers rarely described these women as competent rulers. That would have suggested Rome faced legitimate opposition. Instead, they were portrayed as emotional, impulsive, or doomed by their own ambition. The ancient equivalent of saying, "This was never going to work anyway." Rome's version of history did not shout. It whispered. Over time, those whispers became accepted truth. And the most effective part? Rome made erasure look natural. Future generations assumed these queens were minor figures because Rome told the story that way. No monuments, no celebrations, no names carved in stone, just absence. For the queen, this punishment extended beyond death. Even her memory was no longer hers. She did not just lose her throne, her freedom, or her life. She lost her place in time. Rome did not always need to destroy its enemies. Sometimes it simply edited them out. And that, for an empire obsessed with permanence, was the ultimate victory. Rome did not leave history to chance. It employed writers. And Roman writers, knowingly or not, were some of the empire's most effective executioners. Once a captured queen was defeated, humiliated, imprisoned, erased, or quietly killed, Roman authors stepped in to finish the job. They didn't need chains or guards. They had parchment. And parchment lasts longer than fear. These writers rarely described queens as capable leaders who posed a genuine threat. That would have implied Rome faced serious opposition, which was unacceptable. Instead, queens were reframed as cautionary tales. Their courage became recklessness. Their political skill became manipulation. Their resistance became hysteria. Rome did not argue against these women. It caricatured them. This was done with an air of intellectual superiority. Roman authors presented themselves as calm, rational observers describing irrational figures. The implication was clear. Rome was reason. Resistance was madness. If a queen fought back, it was not because she had strategic goals or popular support. It was because she was emotional, unstable, or doomed by her own ambition. And because Rome controlled education, these portrayals spread. Future scholars learned Roman versions of events. Later historians copied Roman sources. The queens became what Rome said they were, not because it was accurate, but because it was written first and written often. What makes this particularly effective is how subtle it was. Roman writers didn't scream insults. They sighed. They shook their heads on the page. They framed the queen as someone who might have succeeded if only she had known her place. Condescension replaced cruelty, and that made the damage feel reasonable. Even praise, when it appeared, was poisonous. A queen might be described as brave, but only to emphasize how tragic her inevitable failure was. Clever, but fatally misguided. Strong, but unnatural. Compliments that end in inevitability are not compliments at all. By the time centuries passed, the queen was no longer remembered as a ruler who challenged Rome. She was remembered as a mistake that proved Rome's worldview correct. Rome understood something vital. Killing a ruler ends resistance in the present. Writing about them incorrectly prevents resistance in the future. So while soldiers captured queens and officials decided their fate, it was the historians who ensured those queens never truly recovered. They did not just lose their kingdoms. They lost their reputations, and in Rome's empire, that loss was permanent. Rome never punished captured queens for their own sake. That would have been inefficient. Rome punished them for the benefit of everyone else. Every chain, every parade, every carefully timed disappearance was aimed outward, not inward. The queen was merely the delivery system. Empires survive on reputation. Rome knew this. Its armies were strong, yes, but its greatest weapon was expectation. Kingdoms surrendered not just because Rome might win, but because Rome was expected to win. Captured queens helped maintain that expectation. When a foreign ruler watched a Roman triumph, they were not supposed to feel curiosity. They were supposed to feel calculation. If I resist, they were meant to think, this is how it ends. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, publicly, and with paperwork. Rome understood that fear works best when it looks organized. Random brutality creates chaos. Systematic punishment creates obedience. The fate of captured queens was not improvised cruelty. It was policy dressed up as inevitability. The message was especially pointed toward other rulers with influence. Rome wanted them to see that status offered no protection. Royal blood did not grant mercy. Titles did not negotiate better outcomes. In fact, they made punishment worse. The higher you stood, the longer Rome took dismantling you. And the message travelled. Merchants carried stories. Diplomats whispered details. Roman writers embroidered the narrative just enough to make resistance sound foolish. Rome did not need to threaten anyone directly. It let the example speak. There was also a quiet warning aimed at Rome's own allies. Loyalty was rewarded, but independence was not. A queen who stepped outside Roman authority, even briefly, risked becoming a cautionary tale. Cooperation looked safer by comparison. Rome rarely said, "Obey us." It said, "Look what happened to her." And perhaps the most chilling part is how normalized this became. Over time, the punishment of captured queens stopped feeling extraordinary. It became expected. When another ruler fell, people didn't ask what Rome would do. They asked how long it would take. Rome succeeded because it made domination feel predictable, and predictability feels permanent. So when Rome punished captured queens, it wasn't acting out of cruelty alone. It was maintaining an image, one that stretched far beyond the empire's borders and long past the queen's lifetime. She suffered, but the lesson was never meant for her. In the end, Rome did not punish captured queens because they were weak. Rome punished them because they were dangerous, even after defeat. A queen represented an idea Rome could never fully control, authority that did not originate in Rome and did not require Roman approval. Empires can tolerate enemies. They can tolerate rebels. What they struggle with are alternatives. A ruling queen embodied the uncomfortable possibility that power could exist outside Rome's carefully managed hierarchy. She had ruled without Roman law, Roman gods, Roman armies, or Roman paperwork. People had followed her willingly. That fact alone was unsettling enough to warrant correction. Rome was not insecure, but it was thorough. It did not like loose ends, unresolved symbols, or lingering doubts. A captured queen was all three. Leaving her untreated, unprocessed, or insufficiently humiliated risked inspiring the wrong conclusions. Rome preferred its lessons unmistakable, so it dismantled queens piece by piece. First, authority, then dignity, then time, then memory. Rome did not rush. It did not need to. It had centuries to reinforce the same message over and over again. Resist, and you will not simply lose. You will be displayed, delayed, erased, and rewritten. And here is the quiet irony. Rome's harsh treatment of captured queens reveals just how seriously it took them. Empires do not waste energy humiliating insignificant opponents. They reserve that effort for figures who might otherwise be remembered as legitimate alternatives. Queens were punished so carefully because they mattered. Even Rome's historians betrayed this fear. The need to belittle, distort, and diminish these women long after their deaths suggests anxiety, not confidence. Rome wanted future generations to believe these queens were inevitable failures, not leaders who nearly succeeded. And yet, we still talk about them. Despite Rome's best efforts, their stories survived. Fragmented, distorted, incomplete, but alive. Each remembered queen represents a crack in Rome's narrative of inevitability, proof that resistance once existed and was strong enough to worry the most powerful empire of its time. Rome won the wars. Rome controlled the records, but Rome never fully controlled memory. And perhaps that is the final failure. Because an empire that fears how its enemies might be remembered reveals something deeply human beneath all that marble and law. Even Rome was afraid of being challenged. Medieval London did not create crime, but it certainly made it comfortable. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the city was bursting at the seams, with perhaps 80,000 people packed inside old Roman walls, never designed for that many bodies, carts, animals, and ambitions. Streets were narrow, crooked, and often unnamed. Houses leaned outward as each new floor was added, blocking sunlight and trapping smells. If you were looking for order, light, or personal space, you chose the wrong century. Most Londoners lived and worked in the same cramped building. A butcher slept above his shop. An alewife brewed, served, and raised children in the same smoky room. At night, shutters closed, candles flickered, and entire neighbourhoods sank into darkness. There were no streetlights. Moonlight was a luxury. Shadows were everywhere, and they were excellent accomplices. Crime thrived because opportunity was constant. Crowded markets meant distracted customers. Pilgrims and foreign merchants arrived daily with purses full of coin and no idea where they were going. The taverns spilled drunk men into the streets after curfew. Apprentices slept 10 to a room. Servants carried goods through alleys barely wide enough for 2 shoulders. If you wanted to steal, you did not need skill, you needed patience. London's layout did not help law enforcement. The city was divided into wards, each responsible for its own policing. That policing consisted mostly of unpaid local men doing night watch duty with staves and lanterns, assuming they stayed awake. They were neighbours, not professionals, and they knew exactly who lived where, which made enforcing the law awkward. Arresting a stranger was easy. Arresting your cousin was another matter entirely. Then there was the river. The Thames was London's highway, dumping ground, and escape route all in one. Stolen goods vanished onto boats. Bodies occasionally did too. Docks drew sailors, labourers, prostitutes, thieves, and gamblers in equal measure. Where money moved, crime followed. London was also a magnet. If you were poor, desperate, or running from something, the city promised work, anonymity, and chaos. For many, it delivered only hunger and temptation. Theft was not always a career choice. Often, it was a short-term survival strategy that went very wrong. In short, medieval London was noisy, filthy, overcrowded, poorly lit, and loosely policed. It was not a city designed to prevent crime. It was a city that quietly invited it in, shut the door, and pretended not to notice until someone screamed. If medieval London had a background noise, it was the rustle of fingers where they did not belong. Pickpocketing was the most common crime in the city, and also the hardest to stop. Crowds were everywhere. Markets, churchyards, processions, executions and festivals all packed people shoulder to shoulder. Where bodies pressed together, hands wandered. The typical target was not a wealthy noble. It was the ordinary man who carried his entire fortune on his belt. Coins were kept in purses tied with cords, worn openly for convenience and necessity. There were no banks for daily wages. If you earned money, you carried it. And if you carried it, someone noticed. Cut purses specialised in removing those purses with small knives, slicing cords cleanly and quietly. The victim often felt nothing until the weight was gone. Some thieves worked alone, but many operated in groups. One person bumped the target, another shouted or spilled ale, a third made the cut. By the time confusion settled, the purse had already changed hands twice. Children were frequently involved. Orphans and runaways learned quickly that small hands raised less suspicion. They were trained to watch for distracted merchants, drunk sailors, or pilgrims staring at relics instead of their belongings. If caught, children might be beaten or branded, but many judges hesitated to hang them. This made them useful tools in a brutal system. Markets were prime hunting grounds. Buyers focused on haggling. Sellers focused on profit. Thieves focused on both. Church crowds were equally tempting. Piety did not protect your purse, and sermons about sin did little to discourage someone who had not eaten in days. Punishment for theft depended on value. Small thefts might result in fines, time in the stocks, or whipping. Larger sums meant branding on the cheek or forehead, marking the thief forever. Repeat offenders faced mutilation, usually the loss of an ear or hand. Hanging waited at the end of the path, visible to everyone and carefully remembered. Public shame was part of the system. Thieves were paraded through streets, mocked, spat on, and sometimes pelted with rotten food. The goal was deterrence through humiliation, though it often created hardened criminals instead. Despite this, pickpocketing never disappeared. It adapted. Thieves learned new tricks. Londoners learned to clutch their purses tighter. The city accepted it as part of daily life, like mud on boots or smoke in the air. In medieval London, losing your money was not shocking. It was expected. Taverns were where medieval London went to relax, which is precisely why they were where trouble gathered. Ale was cheap, safer than water, and consumed in heroic quantities. By sunset, many taverns were already loud. By nightfall, they were dangerous. Drink loosened tongues, blurred loyalties, and turned small insults into matters of honour that absolutely required fists. Most tavern brawls began over nothing worth remembering. A spilled cup, a disputed dice throw, a perceived insult to a woman who may or may not have been present. Once voices rose, others joined in quickly, either out of loyalty, boredom, or the simple joy of chaos. Benches became weapons. Tankards flew. Knives appeared faster than anyone later admitted. Weapons were common. Men carried daggers as tools as much as arms. Apprentices were forbidden by law from carrying swords, which did not stop them. Sailors brought knives from the docks. Even a broken bottle or a fire poker could become lethal. A brawl that started with shouting could end with a body on the floor and no clear idea of who struck the final blow. Street violence often followed. When taverns closed at curfew, drunk patrons spilled into alleys already dark and narrow. Fights continued outside, sometimes drawing in watchmen who were just as likely to be attacked as assisted. Night watch patrols were poorly paid and poorly trained. Many preferred to shout warnings from a distance rather than intervene directly. The law treated violence seriously, but unevenly. If no one died, punishments ranged from fines to time in the pillory. Serious injuries could lead to imprisonment. Homicide complicated matters. Killing in self-defense was theoretically excusable, but proving it was difficult. Witnesses were often drunk, biased, or conveniently absent. Guild rivalries also fueled violence. Apprentices from different trades clashed regularly, especially during festivals. Bakers fought butchers. Fishmongers fought just about everyone. These were not random fights. They were expressions of identity, loyalty, and long-standing grudges, carried out with enthusiasm and very little planning. Authorities attempted crackdowns, imposing curfews and banning weapons in taverns, but enforcement was inconsistent. Tavern owners depended on rowdy customers. Watchmen depended on not getting stabbed. In the end, tavern violence was tolerated because it was familiar. As long as it stayed within certain bounds, London accepted bruises, broken bones, and the occasional corpse as the price of a city that drank together every night. Medieval London officially disapproved of prostitution, while quietly relying on it. Brothels were considered a necessary evil, a way to prevent worse sins, by channeling male desire into regulated spaces. The city did not ban them outright. Instead, it tried to control them, which meant accepting that sex work was part of urban life, as long as it stayed where authorities could see it. Most legal brothels were concentrated in specific districts, especially Southwark, across the Thames. This area fell under different jurisdiction, conveniently outside the direct control of London's civic authorities. Brothels paid fees, followed rules, and submitted to inspections. Prostitutes were required to wear identifying clothing so they could not be mistaken for honest women, a distinction that mattered deeply in court and on the street. Despite regulation, brothel raids were common. Officials periodically staged moral crackdowns, often during times of political unrest or religious pressure. These raids were less about ending prostitution and more about demonstrating authority. Women were arrested, fined, publicly shamed, or briefly imprisoned, then released back into the same system that had just punished them. Clients were rarely targeted. Men caught during raids were usually warned or ignored entirely, unless they were clergy, married, or politically inconvenient. The burden of morality fell almost entirely on women, especially those without powerful protectors. Illegal brothels also thrived. Some operated out of taverns, bathhouses, or private homes. Others were little more than rooms rented by the night. These spaces lacked protection and were more vulnerable to violence, theft, and exploitation. Prostitutes in illegal establishments could be beaten, robbed, or arrested with little recourse. Sex-related crimes extended beyond prostitution. Adultery, fornication, and sodomy were all subject to punishment, though enforcement depended heavily on witnesses and reputation. Accusations could destroy lives even without proof. A woman's word carried less weight than a man's, and a poor woman's word barely registered at all. Punishments ranged from fines and public penance to imprisonment. In severe or repeated cases, banishment from the city was possible. Public shame was again the preferred weapon. Offenders were paraded, named, and marked as moral failures, their reputations permanently damaged. Brothel raids gave the appearance of moral order while changing very little. The city needed sex workers, sailors needed distraction, and officials needed revenue. Crime in this case was not something medieval London wanted to eliminate. It simply wanted to manage it quietly, preferably without admitting how dependent it truly was. Theft in medieval London was not just a crime, it was a public spectacle waiting to happen. The city believed deeply in visible punishment. Justice was meant to be seen, remembered, and feared. If someone stole, the goal was not rehabilitation. It was warning. Petty theft, such as stealing bread, tools, or clothing, was common, especially during hard winters or food shortages. Courts understood desperation, but rarely excused it. A first-time offender might face a fine or whipping. If they could not pay, which most could not, the punishment became physical. Pain replaced money as currency. Branding was especially feared. A hot iron pressed into the cheek, forehead, or hand marked a thief forever. The mark announced their crime to employers, neighbours, and strangers alike. Once branded, finding honest work became nearly impossible, which quietly encouraged repeat offending. The system created the criminals it claimed to deter. More serious thefts led to mutilation. Ears were cut off. Hands were severed. These punishments were legal, ritualized, and performed publicly. The crowd watched not only for entertainment, but for instruction. Children were brought along to learn consequences early. Execution waited at the far end of the scale. Hanging was the usual method, carried out at sites like Tyburn. Theft above a certain value, or repeated offences, could send a person to the gallows. The threshold for a capital theft was low. A coat, a purse, or a few coins could be enough. Fear shaped daily behaviour. Londoners locked chests, hid valuables, and travelled in groups. Shops installed shutters and bars. People memorised faces, especially those of known criminals. Rumours spread quickly, often exaggerating danger, turning strangers into threats. Yet public punishment also bred sympathy. Crowds sometimes prayed for the condemned. Occasionally they intervened, cutting down a hanging body early in hopes of survival. Executions were terrifying, but they were also communal events, blending justice, religion, and uneasy compassion. Authorities believed harsh punishment preserved order. In reality, it created a city tense with anxiety. Theft did not vanish. It adapted. Criminals became faster, quieter, more selective. Ordinary people learned to live alert, suspicious, and prepared to lose everything in a single careless moment. In medieval London, fear was not a side effect of crime. It was part of the system, carefully cultivated, publicly displayed, and deeply felt by everyone who walked the streets with something worth stealing. When the sun went down in medieval London, the city did not sleep so much as surrender. Darkness transformed familiar streets into uncertain territory. Without streetlights, only candles and hearth fires provided scattered points of glow, and most households extinguished them early to save money. The result was a city where shadows ruled and crimes multiplied. Night was when theft turned bold. Burglars targeted homes and shops, prying shutters, forcing doors, or slipping through unguarded windows. Even churches were not spared. Sacred spaces held valuable vessels, candles, and offerings, and thieves rarely worried about divine punishment when hunger or greed pressed harder. Sacrilege was illegal, but it was also profitable. The city relied on the night watch to maintain order. These watchmen were local men required to serve by obligation, not by desire. They were unpaid or poorly paid, poorly equipped, and often elderly or inexperienced. Armed with staves and lanterns, they patrolled wards in small groups, calling out the hours and watching for suspicious activity. In theory. In practice, many dozed, drank, or avoided confrontation. Challenging armed thieves in narrow alleys was dangerous, and there was little incentive to be brave. A wounded watchman received no compensation. A dead one received prayers. Criminals knew this, and treated the watch as an inconvenience rather than a threat. Curfews were enforced unevenly. Bells signalled when lawful movement should stop, but taverns, brothels, and private gatherings ignored them regularly. Anyone caught outside after curfew could be questioned or detained, but enforcement depended on who you were. Respectable merchants passed more easily than servants or foreigners. Night also concealed violence. Assaults, robberies, and murders were harder to investigate in darkness. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Many cases went unsolved, recorded only as rumours or unexplained deaths. The river absorbed secrets efficiently. The city attempted reforms. More watchmen, stricter curfews, better equipment. None solved the underlying problem. London was too large, too dark, and too crowded for effective nighttime control. For ordinary people, night meant risk. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Families huddled inside. Travel after dark was avoided unless necessary. Those who moved through the city at night did so with purpose, fear, or both. In medieval London, daylight belonged to law and commerce. Night belonged to opportunity, desperation, and the quiet understanding that once darkness fell, help was uncertain and justice could wait until morning. Medieval London's prisons were not places of punishment in the modern sense. They were holding pens, designed to keep bodies contained until a decision was made. Justice moved slowly, and while it did, prisoners waited in conditions that were often worse than the sentence itself. The most infamous prison was Newgate. Its reputation alone inspired fear. Prisoners paid for everything: food, bedding, chains, and even the removal of chains. Those with money lived slightly better. Those without it suffered. Hunger, filth, and disease were constant companions. Rats moved freely. So did lice. Debtors, thieves, murder suspects, and political prisoners were all mixed together. There was little separation by crime, age, or gender. Violence inside prisons was common, and guards often looked the other way unless bribed. Survival depended on connections, strength, or luck. Justice relied heavily on accusation and testimony. Investigations were brief. Evidence was often circumstantial. Juries were composed of local men who might already know the accused or the victim. Reputation mattered enormously. A known troublemaker was easier to condemn than a respected guild member, regardless of facts. Trials could be swift once they began, but reaching that point took time. Prisoners waited weeks or months, unsure whether they would be fined, maimed, banished, or killed. Anxiety was part of the punishment. Confessions were sometimes encouraged through pressure rather than force, though outright torture was rare in England compared to elsewhere. Not all justice was harsh. Courts occasionally showed mercy, especially to first-time offenders or those with community support. Pardons were possible, often granted during religious festivals or royal celebrations. Charity existed alongside cruelty, though unpredictably. Public trust in justice was fragile. Some saw courts as necessary protectors. Others saw them as tools of the powerful. Corruption was an open secret. Bribes could soften sentences. Influence could erase charges. The poor understood that law was not blind. It looked very closely at your status. Prisons embodied this imbalance. They punished poverty as much as crime. For many, the mere act of being imprisoned destroyed their livelihood, family, and future, regardless of outcome. In medieval London, justice was not only about guilt or innocence. It was about endurance. If you survived the waiting, the filth, and the fear, whatever sentence followed might almost feel like a conclusion rather than a beginning. Execution day in medieval London was not quiet, solemn, or private. It was loud, crowded, and disturbingly festive. When word spread that someone was to hang, people came out in force. Vendors sold food, children climbed for a better view. What was meant to inspire fear often slid into entertainment. Most executions took place at established sites such as Tyburn, just outside the city. Condemned prisoners were marched through the streets, sometimes tied to a hurdle or cart, giving the crowd time to gather. This procession mattered. It transformed punishment into a moral lesson on display, a final warning delivered step by step. Hanging was the usual method, especially for thieves. It was simple, cheap, and public. Death was not always quick. Short drops meant slow strangulation. The crowd watched everything. Some jeered, others prayed. A few shouted encouragement, hoping the condemned would repent loudly enough to save their soul, if not their body. Executions reinforced social order. Criminals were shown as cautionary examples, not tragic figures. Yet sympathy often crept in. Many condemned were young, poor, or clearly terrified. Mothers fainted. Friends wept. Sometimes the crowd intervened, pulling on legs to hasten death, an act of grim mercy. Bodies were sometimes left hanging for hours or days, especially in notorious cases. This was meant to extend the lesson. Rotting corpses marked the boundary between law and chaos. Londoners learned where not to step, literally and morally. Not all executions were equal. Nobles convicted of serious crimes might be beheaded instead, a cleaner and faster death. Status followed you to the scaffold. Even in death, hierarchy mattered. Religious rituals softened the moment. Priests offered prayers. Confessions were encouraged. A well-spoken final speech could earn respect or forgiveness. A defiant one could earn hatred. Last words mattered because they were remembered, repeated, and sometimes written down. Execution days revealed a contradiction at the heart of medieval justice. The city wanted fear, order, and obedience, but it also craved drama. Punishment was law, theatre, and morality play combined. For Londoners, the gallows were not abstract threats. They were familiar landmarks. Everyone knew someone who had stood there, waiting. Crime ended lives publicly, loudly, and in full view, ensuring no one forgot what the city demanded in return for order. Crime in medieval London was not an interruption to daily life. It was woven into it. People did not expect safety in the modern sense. They expected risk, loss, and the constant need to stay alert. Survival meant adapting rather than resisting. Londoners learned habits early. Purses were tied tightly and worn under clothing when possible. Doors were barred at dusk. Neighbours listened for unfamiliar footsteps. Strangers were watched carefully, especially at markets and taverns. Trust existed, but it was cautious and conditional. Communities policed themselves as much as the law did. Reputation mattered. A known thief found doors closed and work scarce. Gossip spread faster than official warnings. At the same time, communities protected their own. Witnesses sometimes lied. Juries hesitated to condemn neighbours they knew, even when guilt was obvious. Justice bent under familiarity. Fear shaped social behaviour. Women avoided certain streets alone. Merchants travelled in groups. Apprentices learned which taverns were safest and which to leave before nightfall. Parents warned children not with abstract morals, but with real examples. Everyone knew names of the executed. Everyone knew where it happened. Religion framed crime as sin, but hunger often framed it as necessity. Many criminals did not see themselves as villains. They were labourers without work, servants dismissed without wages, migrants without connections. London attracted them with promise and punished them for believing it. The authorities understood this tension, but rarely addressed its causes. Harsh punishment was easier than reform. Public executions were cheaper than welfare. The city preferred fear over solutions, spectacle over stability. Despite everything, London endured. Trade continued. Taverns stayed full. Markets reopened the day after executions. Crime did not destroy the city. It shaped it. The constant negotiation between danger and order forged a population resilient, suspicious, and deeply practical. Medieval Londoners lived knowing the rules could protect them one day and destroy them the next. Law was visible, violence was public, and survival depended on awareness more than innocence. In the end, crime in medieval London was not an anomaly. It was a consequence of density, poverty, opportunity, and human nature, playing out in narrow streets beneath leaning houses, watched by neighbours who knew exactly how fragile safety really was. Vercingetorix was born into power long before he ever imagined rebellion. His people, the Arverni, were not a minor Gallic tribe tucked away in forests and hills. They were one of the dominant powers of central Gaul, wealthy, militarily respected, and deeply proud of their lineage. To be born Arvernian nobility meant growing up surrounded by authority, expectation, and constant reminders of who you were supposed to become. His family stood near the top of this hierarchy. His father, Celtillus, was no ordinary chieftain. He was influential enough to aspire to kingship, a dangerous ambition in a Gallic world that distrusted centralized power. Among the Arverni, leadership was shared, negotiated, and constantly contested. A man who reached too high risked being accused of tyranny by his own people. From early childhood, Vercingetorix would have been immersed in a warrior aristocracy. Status was proven through courage, generosity, and loyalty, not paperwork or titles. Young boys of noble families were raised to fight, ride, hunt, and endure pain without complaint. Strength was admired, but restraint mattered too. A future leader needed discipline as much as ferocity. He grew up hearing names of ancestors spoken with reverence, their deeds recited during feasts where meat was carved publicly, and honour was distributed along with food. These gatherings were not just celebrations, they were lessons. Every story reinforced the idea that nobility carried obligation. You defended your people. You upheld tradition. You remembered slights. The Arverni world was intensely political. Alliances shifted. Rival clans watched one another carefully. Even within noble families, loyalty could fracture under pressure. Vercingetorix would have learned early that power was fragile, and that admiration could turn to suspicion overnight. And then there was Rome. Not yet an occupying force in his childhood, but a growing presence in stories, trade, and rumours. Rome was distant but looming, described as wealthy, disciplined, and dangerously organised. For a young noble, Rome was both a curiosity and a warning. Vercingetorix's birth placed him inside a system that valued strength, memory, and independence above all else. He was raised not to obey quietly, but to lead loudly. That identity, forged before he ever held a sword in battle, would shape every choice he made once loyalty, survival, and revenge collided. Vercingetorix grew up in a world where memory mattered more than ink. Among the Arverni, writing existed, but it was not trusted with the soul of the people. Laws, history, and identity were carried by voices, not pages. To forget was to lose who you were. To remember was a sacred duty. As a child, Vercingetorix would have listened more than he read. Elders recited genealogies stretching back generations, naming warriors, chiefs, and rivals long dead, but still present in story. These were not distant legends. They were reminders that the living were only temporary custodians of a much older legacy. Every name carried expectations. Bards held enormous influence. They were historians, moral judges, and entertainers all at once. At feasts, they sang of victories and betrayals, praising generosity and mocking cowardice. Their words could elevate a man's reputation or quietly ruin it. Young nobles paid close attention. A future leader needed to understand how stories shaped power. Ritual feasts served as classrooms. Meat was divided according to rank, and every portion was symbolic. Who received the choicest cut was not accidental. Children learned hierarchy without being lectured. You watched, remembered, and absorbed the rules. Mistakes were noticed. Silence taught more than correction. Druids also shaped education, though indirectly. They were keepers of religious law and cosmic order, respected and feared. Noble children were exposed to their teachings through ritual, taboo, and example rather than formal instruction. The idea that the world was governed by unseen balances took root early. Training the mind mattered as much as training the body. Boys were expected to memorize long speeches, poems, and legal precedents. This sharpened memory and discipline. A leader who could not recall promises, insults, or alliances was unfit to rule. Rome, by contrast, wrote everything down. Contracts, orders, laws. Gallic elites knew this and often viewed it with suspicion. Writing fixed power in ways that tradition resisted. For Vercingetorix, oral culture reinforced flexibility, loyalty, and personal honour over abstract authority. By the time he reached adolescence, Vercingetorix was already being shaped by a culture that believed words could bind warriors, and that memory itself was a weapon. Long before he would face Roman legions, he learned to fight battles of narrative, identity, and meaning. Those lessons would prove just as important as any sword. Among the Arverni, childhood did not last long. By the time Vercingetorix could run, he was already being measured for the life of a warrior. Strength, endurance, and courage were not optional traits. They were social currency. A noble boy who could not fight was not merely weak. He was a liability. Physical training began early and was constant. Boys wrestled, raced, and hunted in the forests and hills of central Gaul. These activities were not games. They taught balance, pain tolerance, and teamwork. Injuries were expected. Complaints were discouraged. Endurance earned respect long before adulthood. Weapons were introduced gradually, first spears and shields, then swords. Young nobles practiced formation fighting, learning how to hold ground, protect comrades, and advance under pressure. Individual bravery mattered, but loyalty mattered more. A warrior who broke ranks endangered everyone. Hunting doubled as military preparation. Tracking prey sharpened patience. The kill tested resolve. Feasts that followed reinforced generosity. A successful hunter was expected to share, not hoard. Reputation grew through giving, not keeping. Vercingetorix would have watched older warriors closely. Veterans bore scars openly, proof of survival and honour. Stories of past battles were retold endlessly, emphasising moments of courage and betrayal alike. These stories were warnings as much as inspiration. Discipline was social rather than institutional. Shame enforced behaviour more effectively than punishment. Cowardice was remembered. Bravery was celebrated. Public reputation followed a man everywhere. For a young noble, this created constant pressure to perform. Training also included ritual elements. Before battle or hunts, offerings were made. Oaths were sworn. Warriors believed they were bound not only to each other, but to gods and ancestors who watched closely. Failure was not just personal, it was spiritual. Rome again appeared at the edges of these lessons. Roman soldiers were described as disciplined, relentless, and terrifyingly organized. Gallic warriors admired their strength, but despised their rigidity. To be Gallic was to value personal valor and freedom, even if it came at a cost. By adolescence, Vercingetorix had internalized a warrior identity shaped by physical hardship, public expectation, and sacred obligation. He was being trained not simply to fight, but to command loyalty. That training would soon collide with betrayal, loss, and a lesson that would define his future far more than any victory in the field. For Vercingetorix, the most formative lesson of his youth did not come from training or ritual. It came from watching power turn inward and devour itself. His father, Celtillus, was executed not by foreign enemies, but by fellow Gauls. That fact alone shaped everything that followed. Celtillus was a prominent Arvernian noble, influential enough to attempt what few dared, the restoration of kingship among his people. The Arverni had once ruled widely, but memories of domination bred suspicion. Gallic elites feared any man who gathered too much authority, believing kingship invited tyranny and civil war. Whether Celtillus truly sought absolute power or merely greater unity is unclear. What mattered was perception. Rival nobles accused him of ambition, betrayal, and dangerous consolidation of influence. In a society that prized shared leadership, this was unforgivable. The punishment was public and brutal. Celtillus was executed by his own people, a deliberate act meant to warn others against similar aspirations. For the community, it was justice. For his family, it was devastation. Vercingetorix was still young, but old enough to understand what had happened. His father's name became dangerous to speak. Allies distanced themselves. The family's position collapsed overnight. Nobility did not guarantee protection. Loyalty was conditional. This moment taught Vercingetorix a lesson more powerful than any battle drill. Power without unity invites destruction. His father had not fallen to Rome. He had fallen to fear, jealousy, and fractured leadership. The execution also introduced a quiet, lasting bitterness. The same society that taught loyalty had betrayed one of its own. Honor proved fragile. Justice proved political. From this point forward, Vercingetorix lived with contradiction. He was born to lead, yet leadership had destroyed his father. He was raised to trust his people, yet they had killed their own chief. Rome, distant but growing stronger, now loomed differently. Where Gallic unity had failed, Roman order endured. This contrast planted dangerous ideas. Perhaps the real enemy was not foreign domination, but internal division. Celtilus's death did not immediately turn Vercingetorix into a rebel, but it stripped away innocence. It taught him that survival required more than courage. It required control of loyalty, narrative, and fear. That lesson would stay with him long after childhood ended, shaping how he would later unite tribes, punish dissent, and accept that rebellion, like leadership, demanded sacrifice. After the execution of Celtilus, Vercingetorix did not inherit his father's influence. He inherited his danger. The name that once commanded respect now carried suspicion. In a society where memory mattered, association alone could ruin a future. For a time, silence became his safest strategy. Sources are unclear about formal exile, but it is clear that Vercingetorix was pushed to the margins of power. He was no longer welcomed at councils. His family's voice faded. Survival required restraint. A young noble who spoke too boldly risked following his father's path. This period was quiet, but formative. Without a public role, Vercingetorix learned to observe. He watched how leaders argued, how alliances shifted, how fear guided decisions more than honor. He learned who benefited from his father's death and who quietly regretted it. Isolation hardened him. Warrior culture valued action, yet he was forced into patience. This created an unusual balance. He remained trained for violence, but learned when not to use it. Many warriors never learned that distinction. He also gained exposure to wider Gaul. Moving beyond the Arverni heartland meant encountering other tribes, customs, and rivalries. Each group shared traditions but differed in leadership styles and priorities. Unity was spoken of often, achieved rarely. Rome appeared more clearly during these years. Roman traders, envoys, and soldiers were no longer distant rumours. They were present, organised, and confident. Their alliances with certain Gallic elites created tension. Some chiefs admired Roman stability. Others resented Roman interference, but accepted Roman gold. Vercingetorix saw how Rome exploited division. It rewarded cooperation and punished resistance selectively. This strategy weakened Gaul without open war. The lesson was unmistakable. Silence also allowed grief to settle into resolve. His father's execution was no longer a shock. It became a reference point, a reminder of what fractured leadership cost and what fear-driven politics destroyed. By the end of this period, Vercingetorix was no longer simply a dispossessed noble. He was a careful observer of power, loyalty, and weakness. He had learned that survival required more than bravery. It required timing. This chapter of restraint would make his later actions seem sudden and explosive. In reality, rebellion had been forming quietly, shaped by years of watching Gaul undermine itself, while Rome waited patiently for the pieces to fall. As Vercingetorix moved into early adulthood, Rome stopped being an abstract threat and became a living system he could study. He watched Roman influence spread not through constant violence, but through discipline, infrastructure, and selective generosity. This fascinated and unsettled him in equal measure. Roman soldiers operated differently from Gallic warriors. They drilled constantly. They obeyed orders without debate. Their loyalty was institutional, not personal. Where Gallic leaders relied on reputation and persuasion, Roman commanders relied on structure. Vercingetorix recognized the strength in this, even as he despised its rigidity. He likely encountered Roman auxiliaries and allied Gallic leaders who had adopted Roman customs. Latin words entered Gallic speech. Roman goods circulated widely. Roads cut through tribal lands. Forts appeared where none had existed before. These were not invasions in the dramatic sense. They were quiet assertions of permanence. Some Gallic nobles welcomed this. Roman alliance brought stability, trade, and prestige. Others resented it, but lacked unity to resist. Vercingetorix understood that Rome did not need to conquer Gaul immediately. It could wait while Gaul eroded from within. Importantly, Vercingetorix did not serve Rome in this period, unlike some Gallic leaders who fought as Roman allies. This kept him independent. He learned from observation rather than participation. He studied Roman tactics from the outside, noticing their strengths and potential weaknesses. He saw how Roman armies struggled when supply lines were cut and terrain worked against them. He saw their dependence on discipline and order, traits that could become liabilities in chaotic environments. These observations would later inform his strategy of scorched earth and attrition. At the same time, he recognized that pure Gallic tradition was insufficient. Tribal rivalries, personal ambition and fear had already destroyed unity once. His father's fate remained a warning. Vercingetorix began to imagine a synthesis. Gallic courage combined with Roman-style coordination without Roman domination. This was a radical idea in a culture that prized independence over organization. This period sharpened his strategic thinking. He was no longer just a warrior trained to fight. He was becoming a leader who understood systems. Rome was not invincible, but it could not be confronted blindly. By learning Rome without serving it, Vercingetorix prepared himself for a future confrontation that would demand patience, unity, and a willingness to sacrifice tradition in order to preserve independence. By the time Vercingetorix reached full adulthood, he understood that rebellion would not begin with swords. It would begin with people. Gaul was not a nation. It was a patchwork of tribes, each fiercely independent, each suspicious of the others. Any attempt at unity risked repeating his father's fate. Vercingetorix moved carefully. He spoke first to those who had lost under Roman influence, rather than those who benefited from it. Dispossessed warriors, younger nobles without power, and communities burdened by Roman demands were more receptive. These were people with grievances, but no voice. He framed resistance not as ambition, but as survival. Rome did not need kings. It needed collaborators. Tribal elites who aligned with Rome gained short-term security, but lost autonomy. Vercingetorix emphasized this quietly, allowing others to reach the conclusion themselves. His reputation as Celtilus's son worked both for and against him. Some feared his lineage, others saw it as proof that he understood the cost of disunity. He did not promise glory, he promised discipline, shared sacrifice, and consequence for betrayal. Unlike traditional Gallic leaders, he insisted on obedience. Orders were not suggestions. Dissent had limits. This unsettled some nobles, but appealed to warriors tired of indecision. Vercingetorix understood that Rome would exploit hesitation mercilessly. Ritual played a role. Oaths were sworn publicly. Feasts reinforced bonds. Religion was invoked not just for legitimacy, but for accountability. Breaking unity became not only political treachery, but spiritual failure. At the same time, Roman presence increased. Caesar's campaigns elsewhere in Gaul sent shockwaves. Tribes watched cities fall, leaders executed, and resistance crushed. Fear spread faster than hope. Vercingetorix leveraged this fear. He argued that delay guaranteed subjugation. Unity offered at least a chance. His message was not optimistic, it was urgent. This stage was fragile. One betrayal could destroy everything. One accusation of ambition could echo his father's end. Vercingetorix balanced authority and restraint constantly, aware that leadership itself was still suspect. What he gathered during this period was not an army, but momentum. Loyalty rooted in shared risk, rather than shared victory. The groundwork was laid not with triumph, but with consent forged under pressure. Rebellion was no longer an idea. It was becoming a possibility. As unity slowly formed, Vercingetorix faced a decision that would define him long before open war began. Resistance against Rome could not look like past Gallic uprisings. Meeting Roman legions head-on in traditional battle had failed too many times. Courage alone was not enough. Something harsher was required. Vercingetorix chose denial over confrontation. If Rome thrived on supply, order and stability, then Gaul would become unstable by design. Crops would be destroyed, villages burned, food denied not just to Roman armies, but to Gauls themselves. It was a strategy that demanded obedience and sacrifice on a scale Gaul had never attempted. This decision was deeply unpopular. Gallic identity was tied to land, harvest, and hospitality. Burning one's own fields felt like betrayal. Many chiefs hesitated. Some openly resisted the idea. Vercingetorix did not waver. Rome could rebuild. Gaul could not survive occupation. Enforcing this policy required authority bordering on tyranny. Communities that refused faced punishment. Livestock was seized. Leaders were threatened. Unity now had teeth. For the first time, resistance demanded more than enthusiasm. It demanded submission to strategy. This was the shadow of his father's lesson. Celtillus had reached too far without securing obedience. Vercingetorix would not repeat that mistake. Unity would be enforced, not requested. The moral weight of this choice was immense. Families watched their homes burn by Gallic hands. Hunger followed. Resentment simmered. Yet the alternative was Roman seizure, taxation, and permanent control. Vercingetorix framed destruction as temporary suffering for long-term survival. Rome underestimated this resolve. Roman commanders expected rebellion to fracture under pressure. Instead, they encountered scorched land and empty roads. Supply lines stretched thin, discipline strained. This moment marked the true beginning of Vercingetorix's rebellion, even before battles were fought. He had transformed resistance from defiance into policy. Gaul was no longer reacting. It was shaping the battlefield. The cost was immense, but the choice was deliberate. Vercingetorix accepted that leadership meant being hated as much as followed. Survival required cruelty turned inward. By choosing fire over submission, he crossed a line few Gallic leaders dared approach. From this point forward, retreat was impossible. Only victory or annihilation remained. By the time open war loomed, the early life of Vercingetorix was already over, even if his greatest battles had yet to be fought. The boy raised among feasts, stories, and warrior games no longer existed. In his place stood a man shaped by betrayal, patience, and ruthless clarity. Everything that defined him had been forged before Caesar ever marched deep into Gaul. His noble birth taught him leadership carried obligation. Oral tradition taught him that memory outlived victory. Warrior training taught him endurance. His father's execution taught him that unity mattered more than honor. Exile taught him restraint. Rome taught him strategy. Fire taught him authority. Vercingetorix did not stumble into rebellion. He arrived at it deliberately. Unlike earlier Gallic leaders who rose in moments of panic or pride, Vercingetorix understood timing. He waited until fear outweighed comfort, until Roman presence felt permanent, until hesitation became more dangerous than resistance. When he finally acted, it felt sudden only to those who had not been watching. This is what made him different. He did not promise easy triumph. He promised survival at a terrible price. He asked Gaul to suffer now to exist later. Many followed him not because they loved him, but because they believed him. His authority no longer came from blood alone. It came from coherence. He offered something rare in Gaul: direction, in a land used to fragmentation that made him inevitable. Even his enemies sensed it. Roman sources describe him not as a barbarian chief acting on impulse, but as a commander capable of learning, adapting, and enforcing discipline. That reputation did not appear overnight. It was earned long before swords crossed. The early life of Vercingetorix explains why he could unite tribes that had distrusted one another for generations, why he could order destruction and be obeyed, why he could hold power without a crown in a culture that despised kings. By the time history notices him, the foundation is already complete. The rebellion that follows is not the story of a sudden uprising. It is the culmination of a childhood lived under pressure, in a society tearing itself apart while a greater power closed in. Vercingetorix did not rise from nowhere. He rose from memory, loss, and preparation, and by then, Gaul had no other choice. Long before Alexandria rose to dominate Egypt's coastline, Thonis-Heracleion stood watch at the mouth of the Nile, controlling the most important gateway into the kingdom. Every ship arriving from the Mediterranean passed its harbours first. This alone made the city indispensable. It was not simply a port. It was Egypt's customs gate, religious threshold, and economic filter rolled into one. The Nile Delta was Egypt's lifeline, and Thonis-Heracleion sat precisely where river and sea met. Goods flowed through its docks in constant motion. Grain from the fertile interior, papyrus, linen, gold, and sacred offerings moved outward. Wine, olive oil, metalwork, and foreign luxuries moved in. Officials monitored cargo, collected taxes, and enforced regulations long before merchants could trade deeper inland. The city was built for water. Canals replaced streets. Boats replaced carts. Warehouses, temples, and administrative buildings rose along shifting channels that connected the city's many islands. To an arriving sailor, Thonis-Heracleion must have felt alive, almost floating, with traffic moving in every direction and ritual activity woven directly into commerce. Power here was not only economic. Thonis-Heracleion was also sacred space. Before foreign traders were allowed to conduct business in Egypt, they were required to make offerings to the gods of the city. Temples stood near the docks, ensuring that trade began with ritual submission. This blending of religion and administration reinforced Egypt's worldview. Prosperity flowed from divine favour, not mere profit. The city's population reflected its role as a gateway. Egyptian priests lived alongside Greek merchants. Sailors, translators, tax collectors and labourers crowded the harbours. Languages overlapped, customs mixed, yet order remained strict. This was not a free port. It was controlled, observed, and regulated at every level. For centuries, Thonis-Heracleion thrived because of its position. As long as the Nile fed Egypt and the sea brought trade, the city mattered. It grew wealthy, confident, and deeply embedded in Egypt's infrastructure. No one building temples or warehouses here believed the ground beneath them would ever fail. From the surface, Thonis-Heracleion looked eternal, anchored between river and sea, unaware that the very water sustaining it was quietly preparing its disappearance. Thonis-Heracleion was not just a city with two names. It was a city that lived in two cultural realities at once. To the Egyptians, it was Thonis, a sacred port bound to ritual law, divine authority, and the ancient rhythms of the Nile. To the Greeks, it was Heracleion, a familiar gateway named after Heracles, the hero they believed had once set foot on its shores. Both names were used, often by the same people, depending on who was listening. This dual identity reflected the city's unique position at the crossroads of civilizations. Greek merchants arriving from the Aegean did not feel entirely foreign here. They recognized the name Heracleion, saw familiar gods equated with their own, and found communities already adapted to cross-cultural exchange. Egyptian priests, meanwhile, maintained strict religious control, ensuring that foreign presence never challenged sacred order. The blending was practical, not sentimental. Egyptians tolerated Greek traders because they brought wealth and goods Egypt desired. Greeks respected Egyptian ritual because access to trade depended on it. Religion became the common language. Greek gods were identified with Egyptian ones. Heracles was linked to local deities associated with strength and protection. This made commerce smoother and conflict rarer. Documents and inscriptions suggest that Thonis-Heracleion functioned as Egypt's official international port before Alexandria existed. Foreign ships were required to dock here, register cargo, and pay dues. Only then could they travel onward. This gave the city enormous leverage. It decided who entered Egypt and under what conditions. Daily life reflected this balance. Greek sailors drank in Egyptian taverns. Egyptian officials learned Greek words of trade. Mixed households were not uncommon, yet boundaries remained. Sacred spaces stayed Egyptian. Political authority remained local. Cultural exchange occurred, but always under supervision. The city's two names were not competing identities. They were tools. Each allowed different groups to understand the same place through familiar concepts. Thonis-Heracleion succeeded because it could be many things at once without losing control. This flexibility made it prosperous and resilient, but it also made it dependent on stability. The city thrived as long as trade flowed and rituals held meaning. When those conditions changed, its carefully balanced world would have nothing solid to stand on except water, memory, and a name that would eventually sink with it. Religion was not confined to quiet sanctuaries in Thonis-Heracleion. It dominated the city's layout, rhythm, and authority. Temples were not built away from commerce. They rose directly beside harbours and canals, ensuring that sacred presence watched every arrival, every transaction, and every departure. The most important sanctuary was dedicated to Amun-Gereb, a local form of the powerful god Amun. This temple was immense, built of stone, meant to last forever, anchored by colossal statues and sphinxes that guarded its approaches. To step into the city was to step into divine territory. No ship entered without passing these symbols of authority. Sacred canals connected temples to one another, turning ritual processions into floating ceremonies. Priests moved statues of gods through the waterways on elaborate barges during festivals, reenacting myths and renewing divine favour. These events were not private. They were public performances of power, reminding inhabitants and foreigners alike who truly ruled the city. Offerings filled temple storehouses. Gold, grain, incense, and imported luxuries flowed into sacred hands. Temples acted as banks, redistributing wealth, funding construction, and supporting priestly hierarchies. Religious authority and economic control were inseparable. The architecture itself reinforced permanence. Massive stone blocks rested on what seemed like solid ground. Columns rose from platforms built to resist flooding. To ancient builders, the city felt secure, protected by gods and engineering alike. Foreigners were required to participate, at least symbolically. Before trading, merchants offered gifts or paid ritual fees. This was not simple superstition. It was political theology. Egypt's wealth existed because the gods allowed it. Ignoring them invited chaos. The temples also stored records, measured water levels, and regulated calendars. They were administrative centres disguised as sacred spaces. Knowledge flowed through priests as much as power did. Ironically, this emphasis on permanence made the city vulnerable. Heavy stone structures pressed into unstable sediment, accelerating subsidence. The very monuments meant to anchor Thonis-Heracleion helped pull it downward over centuries. Still, during its height, the city's temples stood as visible proof that divine order and human ambition could coexist. River and sea met beneath sacred watch, and for generations, Thonis-Heracleion appeared unmovable. The gods seemed firmly planted. The water seemed obedient. No one suspected that the foundations beneath those towering sanctuaries were slowly dissolving, grain by grain, preparing to erase a sacred city from the surface of the world. Thonis-Heracleion did not become powerful by accident. Its wealth came from control, not excess. Every ship that entered Egypt through the Nile Delta was required to stop here, and every stop generated revenue. Taxes, storage fees, ritual offerings and inspections turned movement into money. The harbour was constantly alive. Merchant vessels from Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and the wider Mediterranean anchored beside Egyptian barges loaded with grain and stone. Cranes and labourers worked along quays built of wood and stone. Warehouses rose close to the water, so goods could be transferred quickly before tides or currents shifted. Trade was regulated tightly. Officials recorded cargo, weighed goods, and enforced restrictions. Certain items could not pass inland without permission. Smuggling was punished severely. Thonis-Heracleion was both a marketplace and a checkpoint. Ritual framed every transaction. Before unloading, captains made offerings to local gods. Sacred fees were paid alongside taxes. These acts reinforced Egypt's authority and reminded foreigners that commerce here was never purely economic. Annual festivals amplified the city's importance. Sacred processions drew crowds from across the delta. Divine statues were carried on barges through canals, accompanied by music, incense, and chanting. These events blended religion and spectacle, reinforcing loyalty and attracting visitors. Wealth concentrated in visible ways. Colossal statues decorated shrines, and finely carved reliefs displayed prosperity. Coins and imported luxuries circulated widely. Even ordinary labourers experienced the city's abundance through festivals and temple distributions. Yet prosperity bred dependence. Thonis-Heracleion's identity was tied almost entirely to its function as a gateway. It did not diversify its role. As long as trade flowed through it, the city thrived. If routes changed, relevance would vanish. This vulnerability was invisible at first. For centuries, nothing challenged the city's position. The Nile continued to flow. Ships continued to arrive. Temples continued to receive offerings. But beneath the surface, pressure built. Sediment shifted. Foundations strained. And far to the west, Alexandria had not yet been founded, but the conditions for its rise were already forming. Thonis-Heracleion stood at the peak of its influence, wealthy, sacred, and indispensable. It did not realize that its greatest strength, control of trade, would one day be transferred elsewhere, leaving its temples, harbours, and rituals without purpose, standing on ground that could no longer support them. Thonis-Heracleion did not collapse because of invasion or sudden catastrophe. It failed quietly, from below. The city was built on layers of soft Nile silt, sediment deposited over centuries by shifting river channels. This ground looked solid, but it behaved more like a sponge than stone. As long as conditions remained stable, the city endured. When they changed, the land itself began to betray it. Earthquakes in the eastern Mediterranean periodically shook the delta. Even mild tremors had serious consequences here. Waterlogged soil lost strength, a process now known as liquefaction. Buildings that had stood for generations suddenly tilted, cracked, or sank. Foundations slid sideways. Stone blocks shifted out of alignment. Canals widened where the ground collapsed inward. Rising sea levels compounded the problem. As the Mediterranean slowly encroached inland, salt water seeped into the delta's sediments, weakening them further. Flooding became more frequent. Neighbourhoods closest to the coast suffered first. Streets turned into permanent waterways. Houses were abandoned, then swallowed. The weight of monumental architecture made everything worse. Temples and statues pressed downward relentlessly. Structures designed to last forever accelerated their own destruction. When the ground softened, heavy stone had nowhere to go but down. The process was gradual but relentless. One generation adapted, the next rebuilt. Canals were rerouted, platforms were raised. Repairs were constant, expensive, and increasingly ineffective. Each fix brought time, not stability. People noticed. Priests interpreted disasters as divine warnings. Officials struggled to maintain infrastructure. Trade slowed as harbours became unreliable. Ships avoided shallower, shifting channels. Confidence eroded alongside the land. There was no single moment when Thonis-Heracleion was declared doomed. Instead, the city faded in stages. Areas were abandoned quietly. Rituals moved elsewhere. Administration shifted inland. What remained stood increasingly isolated, surrounded by water and silence. Nature did not erase the city violently. It absorbed it. Stones slipped beneath mud. Statues toppled and disappeared. Temples sank intact, preserving their shape even as they vanished. By the time the final structures went under, Thonis-Heracleion was already a shadow of itself. The city that once controlled Egypt's gateway had become an inconvenience, then a memory. The ground had spoken slowly, patiently, and without drama, and eventually it won. As Thonis-Heracleion weakened, the world around it changed. The city's decline did not occur in isolation. Political power, trade routes, and strategic priorities shifted, leaving the once essential port increasingly sidelined. The most decisive blow came not from nature, but from replacement. In the late 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great founded Alexandria to the west. Unlike Thonis-Heracleion, Alexandria was built on firmer ground and designed with long-term expansion in mind. Its harbours were deep, protected, and better suited to large fleets. From the beginning, it was meant to be a capital, not merely a checkpoint. Trade followed stability. Merchants preferred reliable docks and predictable administration. Royal patronage flowed into Alexandria, drawing artisans, scholars, and officials. Customs duties were redirected. Religious prestige followed power, and temples that once mattered in Thonis-Heracleion lost influence. The old port struggled to compete. Its harbours silted. Repairs grew more expensive. Each earthquake or flood pushed the city further toward irrelevance. Administrators relocated. Priests followed. Rituals that once anchored identity moved inland or westward. This was not a dramatic abandonment. Families left gradually. Warehouses emptied. Temples fell silent. Boats bypassed familiar channels. What had been the gateway to Egypt became a backwater, then a hazard. Nature finished what politics began. Flooding erased remaining neighbourhoods. Canals merged with the sea. Buildings collapsed quietly beneath the waterline. The city slipped beneath the delta with no ceremony. By the early medieval period, Thonis-Heracleion was gone. Its name survived in texts, but its location was lost. Maps showed only water. Alexandria reigned supreme, its libraries and harbours eclipsing the memory of earlier ports. The rise of Alexandria sealed Thonis-Heracleion's fate. It did not just replace the city, it erased the need for it. What remained was a sunken shell, preserved by mud and silence, waiting for a future that had no memory of the port that once controlled Egypt's entrance to the world. Once Thonis-Heracleion disappeared beneath the waters of the Nile Delta, it did not leave ruins behind for travellers to wander over. It left nothing visible at all. No broken columns on land, no half-buried walls. Only water, mud, and shifting currents. Over time, this absence transformed the city from history into legend. Ancient writers mentioned Thonis and Heracleion in passing. Herodotus described a great port at Egypt's entrance. Other sources referenced temples, rituals, and foreign merchants. But without physical remains, later scholars argued over whether these accounts referred to one city, several cities, or something symbolic rather than real. Some believed Thonis-Heracleion was exaggerated. Others thought it had been confused with Canopus or Alexandria. Without evidence, the debate stalled. Maps were redrawn. The city faded from serious discussion. By the modern era, it existed mostly as a footnote, a curiosity mentioned and then dismissed. Local fishermen occasionally spoke of stone shapes beneath the water, nets snagged on something solid, anchors caught unexpectedly. But the delta is full of debris, and such stories rarely travelled far. Mud hid everything quickly. The Nile is efficient at erasing its past. For more than 1,000 years, The city lay intact beneath layers of silt. Statues rested where they fell. Temples remained standing, their columns slowly sinking but not collapsing. Ships settled gently into the harbour floor, cargo still aboard. Time slowed underwater. Ironically, submersion preserved what abandonment could not. Unlike cities looted or dismantled, Thonis-Heracleion was sealed. No later builders reused its stone. No conquerors stripped its temples. The city was not destroyed. It was archived. To historians, this absence created doubt. Civilizations were expected to leave scars on the landscape. A city of such importance should have left something behind. The silence felt suspicious. And yet, the silence was real. Thonis-Heracleion had not vanished because it never existed. It vanished because it had sunk completely, swallowed by the very waters that once made it powerful. The sea kept its secret patiently, while history moved on, convinced the city belonged more to myth than reality. That illusion would not last forever. In the late 20th century, the myth finally began to crack. Advances in underwater surveying technology made it possible to search the muddy seabed of the Nile Delta, systematically rather than blindly. In 1996, a team led by French underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio began scanning areas long suspected to hide something ancient, though few believed an entire city would ever be found. What emerged was not a ruin in fragments, but a city frozen in collapse. Beneath several meters of water and thick layers of silt lay massive stone blocks, toppled columns and statues larger than any fishing debris could explain. Sonar maps revealed streets, canals, and harbour basins. This was not coincidence. It was urban planning. When divers descended, the scale became undeniable. Colossal statues of kings and gods lay on their sides, faces still intact. Sphinxes rested in the mud, half buried but unmistakable. Temple walls stood where they had fallen, preserved by sediment that protected them from erosion. Shipwrecks filled the ancient harbour. More than 70 vessels were eventually identified, some loaded with cargo, others likely ceremonial barges. Anchors, ropes, and wooden hulls told the story of a port frozen mid-function. Trade had not slowly decayed here. It had been interrupted. Inscriptions confirmed the city's identity. Names of gods, rulers, and places matched ancient texts. Thonis and Heracleion appeared together, solving a long-standing historical debate. The legendary port was real, and it lay exactly where ancient sources hinted. The discovery stunned archaeologists. Unlike land sites damaged by centuries of looting, Thonis-Heracleion was remarkably intact. Statues had fallen, but not shattered. Temples had sunk, but not been dismantled. Even delicate objects survived in oxygen-poor mud. Each excavation season revealed more. Gold ritual objects, coins spanning centuries, everyday tools abandoned where they fell. The city's final moments were not violent. They were quiet, sudden enough to halt activity, but gentle enough to preserve it. For historians, the discovery rewrote Egypt's coastal history. Thonis-Heracleion was no longer a rumour. It was a missing chapter recovered almost intact. After more than 1,000 years beneath the water, the city had finally resurfaced, not to return to life, but to speak again, stone by stone, from the seabed, where it had waited patiently for memory to catch up. Thonis-Heracleion is not important merely because it was lost and found. Its true value lies in what it reveals about how civilizations rise, adapt, and quietly disappear. This was not a marginal city erased by war. It was central, wealthy, sacred, and essential. And yet it vanished almost without protest. The city shows how dependent power can be on geography. Thonis-Heracleion thrived because of water, trade routes, and ritual authority. The same environment that sustained it also doomed it. When land softened and sea levels rose, wealth and tradition offered no protection. The gods were honoured, the taxes paid, the rituals performed, yet nature did not negotiate. It also reveals how fragile memory is. For centuries, Scholars doubted the city's existence because nothing remained on land. History favoured what could be seen. Thonis-Heracleion reminds us that absence does not mean insignificance. Entire worlds can vanish without leaving visible scars. The city reshapes our understanding of ancient Egypt's relationship with the Mediterranean. It proves that cultural exchange was not occasional, but systematic. Greeks and Egyptians interacted daily, under strict regulation but constant contact. Globalization is not modern, it is ancient. There is also a warning here. Thonis-Heracleion did not collapse suddenly enough to inspire reform. Its decline was gradual, manageable, easy to postpone. Repairs were made, adjustments followed. No single disaster forced evacuation. By the time abandonment became inevitable, it was already too late. Underwater preservation gives us a rare gift, a city unaltered by later generations. What we see is not rebuilt history, but interrupted life. Tools left behind, ships still moored, statues fallen where they stood. It is archaeology without overprinting. Today, Thonis-Heracleion rests beneath shallow water, still largely unexplored. Most of the city remains untouched, sealed by silt. What has been uncovered is only a fraction of what exists. The sunken city teaches us humility. Civilizations do not always end in fire or conquest. Sometimes they sink quietly, remembered only when technology and curiosity finally catch up. Thonis-Heracleion ruled Egypt's gateway for centuries. Now it lies beneath it, preserved not by stone or memory, but by water, waiting patiently beneath the delta, reminding us how easily permanence dissolves.